Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to give folks just a minute to get into the room and we will get started. All right. Hopefully we'll have a few more folks joining us, but we'll go ahead and kick off today. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar to discuss instructional coherence. My name is Courtney Bell, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Innovation at SCORE, the State Collaborative on Reforming Education. I'm honored to have you all joining us for the conversation today to discuss how we can build upon our state's response to instruction and intervention framework by leveraging the research-based guidelines around high-dosage tutoring and the growing evidence base around instructional coherence. We are excited today to highlight cutting-edge research on instructional coherence where schools align the academic content of their intervention periods to their core instructional materials. In the first half of our call, I will provide a brief overview of an instructional coherence pilot in Knox County schools. And then following that presentation, we will get the opportunity to hear directly from the leaders who drove this work on the ground about what it took to implement an instructionally coherent approach to intervention and how they're scaling their learnings, as well as from a national leader who will help us situate these learnings in the broader context of the research base that supports high dosage small group tutoring as a proven strategy for accelerating student learning. So to start us off, we're going to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say instructional coherence. So Tennessee, like most states across the country, has a tiered intervention system that leverages increasingly intensive support for students who are not meeting grade level expectations. This process is typically driven by the administration of an assessment called a universal screener, which is used to identify students who are behind. The score the student receives on that universal screener places them in a tier for support, with tier 1 being students who are on track, tier 2 being students who need to receive some type of more intensive small group support, and tier 3 being students who are furthest behind and require daily intensive small group support. Historically in Tennessee, when a student has been identified for tier 2 or tier 3 support, they've been pulled out of their regular classroom into a small group with other students who scored around the same percentile as them. During this small group time, they may be working with a trained interventionist who's using a research-based intervention-specific curriculum, which typically follows a separate scope and sequence that's not aligned to what they're doing in the regular classroom. Or they may be working independently on a computer-based intervention program that prioritizes skills that may not be aligned to their grade level learning. We send kids for hours of additional support each week, support that is using research-based strategies and approaches, but that is not reinforcing the learning they're doing in their regular classroom or addressing their specific grade level gaps. Our working hypothesis has been that if students aren't finding success in a traditional classroom, they must need something different. So at the first sign of weakness, we change the setting, the group size, the instructor, the materials, the routines, the scope and sequences, the progressions. But what we've seen is that something different often leaves students feeling confused, disoriented, and dejected because it's so disconnected from their day-to-day learning. Instructionally coherent intervention, which we'll talk about today, operates under a different working hypothesis, which is that if students aren't finding success in a traditional classroom setting, they might just need more time with the same high-quality content, but in a smaller group. Instructionally coherent intervention starts with the high-quality materials being used in the Tier 1 classroom. Students engage with the same scope and sequence, routines, and progressions used in core instruction. The time is used to address specific skill deficits and to build knowledge that allows students to go back to their core classroom the next day and engage in Tier 1 instruction in a deeper and more confident way. We first became keyed into the potential of instructional coherence through a cross-district network SCORE facilitated on high-dosage tutoring from 2022 to 2023. Our network was focused on helping districts schedule and plan for high-dosage tutoring, which state recommended guidance suggested that students who were just a bit behind, so around the 40th percentile, would benefit most from that and would be focused on academic acceleration. Tutoring was intended to leverage the same high-quality instructional materials that were used in the Tier 1 setting. Because percentiles are used as recommendations for settings like Tier 2, Tier 3, or tutoring, we noticed that some students who would have been flagged for Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention were receiving high-dosage tutoring with their core instructional materials instead. Some students who, based on their percentile rank, we would have assumed would have been placed in a Tier 2 or Tier 3, actually remained in their Tier 1 classroom. So this gave us sort of a natural experiment to look into. For kids who were behind, they were pulled into one of 4 different situations. First option is they stayed where they were in their Tier 1 classroom with the high-quality grade level materials. The second option is they were placed into a high-dosage tutoring group where they were pulled out for 30 minutes 3 times a week in groups of no more than 3, but still using their high-quality grade level materials. The third option is they were pulled out for 30 minutes every day in groups of 5 and were engaging with different materials. And the fourth option is they were pulled out daily for 40 to 60 minutes in groups of 3, and again, were engaging with different materials. Now, you would imagine that the group of students who were placed in a Tier 3 setting, meaning they received up to 5 hours of additional focused support in groups of 3 each week, would have made the most growth. But what we found was surprising. As we followed these students, we found that what mattered more than time or group size seemed to be who experienced coherence between their core instruction and their academic support experience. Students getting the coherent experience grew significantly more than students who experienced a business as usual intervention. Further, we found that the students who were furthest behind, those scoring at the 10th percentile and below on their universal screeners, made 50% more growth when they received no intervention at all than when they experienced the incoherent intervention for 5 hours a week. All this leads to the reason we are here today. Picking up on those promising early signals, Knox County Schools stepped forward, agreeing to pilot an instructionally coherent approach to literacy intervention for students in kindergarten through 3rd grade. In this effort, 3 activities emerged as prerequisites for effectively adopting this approach. First, Knox County Schools expanded their vision for literacy instruction and commitment to research-backed instruction through high-quality instructional materials. For Knox County Schools, this included a district-wide literacy vision that served as a North Star for educators and leaders. By framing literacy as a deserved right for every student and detailing how schools and the district would work toward this, Knox County sent a clear message about this priority. Second, they implemented a more targeted data strategy to pinpoint student needs and create data-driven small groups for intervention. To do this, participating schools used quick phonics and quick spelling assessments, which are diagnostics that are embedded in their Tier 1 materials, to go beyond the data that they received from their universal screeners. Universal screeners are incredibly useful for identifying which students need extra support, but they're often unable to identify why those students need extra support. When KCS supplemented their screener data with the curriculum-based diagnostic, they could identify which skills students needed to prioritize, which allowed them to triage students into groups working on similar skills together for a narrowly focused intervention on the skills that would move them toward literacy. Third, they integrated informal progress monitoring through a foundational skills mastery tracker, enabling educators to respond quickly to student learning. Building upon the strong data tracking for why a student needed intervention initially, they built these mastery trackers that enabled them to examine the student's needs over time. This allowed them to be responsive to students' evolving needs and use both formal and informal data to determine when and how to advance students to new skill sets. This enabled teachers and interventionists to easily track student growth across both core instruction and intervention, as both aggregated anecdotal progress notes and formal assessment growth were all in one place, allowing teachers and interventionists to make instructional decisions responsively in real time based on student growth. Let's now turn to the randomized control trial and its results. Because we are focused on the instructional coherence of Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, only students qualifying for those interventions could be considered for participation. Across the 4 participating pilot schools, 328 students participated. And by the time researchers accounted for attrition, there were 179 students treated through an instructionally coherent approach and 117 students who experienced business as usual with instructionally distinct but still high quality instructional materials. This focus on coherence between core instruction and intervention means that day-to-day operations at pilot schools closely mirrored previous years of RTI intervention, only changing the instructional materials being used. Among things that could be changed to affect student outcomes, such as intervention modality, tutor type and preparation, tutor to student ratios, and dosage, KCS was careful to ensure that the effect of instructional coherence was the core analytical focus. The question was not whether small group intervention helps. It does. But whether students learn more when the additional support is delivered in alignment with the learning that's happening in Tier 1. With this design in place, KCS moved from promising signals in the 22-23 network to causal evidence in the 2024-25 pilot. Diving into the results of the randomized control trial, students who received instructionally coherent intervention demonstrated 1.3 months of additional literacy growth on average. It's important to note that these gains came on top of the growth already associated with intervention in the business as usual control group. This improvement translated to nearly 5 percentile ranks of higher achievement for students and was achieved with no additional investment in time, staff, or materials. Both the treatment and control groups received the same dosage and the same group size for intervention. The key difference was whether they used the same instructional materials across core instruction and intervention. Also excitingly, when intervention reinforced what students were already learning in class, the effect was strongest for students who entered the year performing near the 10th percentile of their grade, as well as male students. For these subgroups of students, additional learning reaches as high as 1.8 months for lower performing students and 2.2 months for male students. Within the pilot, one of the 4 schools has uniquely promising results. Throughout the pilot, Pond Gap Elementary had the most thorough implementation of the schools participating in the pilot. Under the leadership of Principal Taisha Young, who we'll get to hear from in just a little bit on the panel, Pond Gap was able to unlock 4.1 months of additional learning for students in instructionally coherent intervention. Once again, I want to highlight that these are months of learning in addition to the learning that was already happening through our current RTI process. Stepping back to look at how this impacted Pond Gap students, instructional coherence led to a 37% reduction in the proportion of students needing intervention in the 2024-25 academic year as compared to the prior academic year. At Pond Gap, Principal Young worked to achieve this phenomenal level of student growth through 3 major shifts. First, Pond Gap made literacy intervention a priority for school leadership in a way that they hadn't before. Second, staff received training and hired the paraprofessionals necessary to support recommended intervention group sizes in both the control and the pilot. Third, they extended the windows of their data cycles, giving students more time to practice weaker skills and grow over time. These strong results, especially those from Pond Gap, are exciting and just the beginning of the impact that instructional coherence can have on students in our schools. Adopting an instructionally coherent approach to intervention has add-on effects that maximize district resources through 2 key levers. The first is curriculum efficiency. By leveraging their existing high-quality instructional materials across academic settings, districts can streamline the amount of funding they spend on materials. This allows districts pursuing instructional coherence to purchase a singular curriculum for core instruction and intervention rather than purchasing separate curricula for both. For KCS, we calculated a potential savings of $530 per student receiving intervention, or nearly $2 million if all KCS students in kindergarten through 5th grade had used their core instructional materials for intervention. The second resource maximizing lever of instructional coherence is that it's relatively resource neutral to implement. When researchers examined how results varied by interventionist training and experience level, as well as group size, they found the configurations with strongest learning gains were also maximizing resources. First, Tutors with a bachelor's degree were more effective than tutors with a master's degree, and paraprofessionals were just as effective as teachers in creating learning gains through instructional coherence. This opens a huge opportunity to invest in training for critical support staff to engage more deeply in small group instruction. Second, small groups with 4 to 5 students were just as effective as groups with 3 or fewer students. Together, this means the most effective intervention groups also enable schools to efficiently maximize resources by reserving teachers for core instruction while leveraging paraprofessionals for intervention in groups of 4 to 5 students. Building upon this evidence, we also asked what teachers thought of instructional coherence and found that teachers prefer an instructionally coherent approach to intervention 4 to 1. Among teachers that preferred instructional coherence, the majority cited both better alignment to Tier 1 and ease in implementation as the key reasons they preferred it as an approach. We heard similar praise from school leaders who now recognize the importance of alignment. One of our favorite ANIC data points is from when a school leader shared, "I really appreciate that the materials are aligned with Tier 1 instruction and represent a significant improvement over the intervention resources we've used in the past. They are grounded in the science of reading and are noticeably more engaging for students." Additionally, the ability to target specific skills through the administration of the QSA and QPA has made our intervention efforts more focused and effective. So to summarize, instructionally coherent intervention supports students to accelerate their learning, especially those who are furthest behind. It allows districts to streamline resources, purchasing just a single high-quality curriculum and training all teachers and support staff in the building on how to use it well across settings. Teachers and leaders prefer the coherent approach. It is so rare to find educational improvement strategies that are truly win-win, and this one feels like a triple threat. Good for kids, good for educators, and good for budgets. Let's dive into our panel next to hear more and discuss how we can spread and scale this promising practice. While we bring our panelists to the virtual stage, I also want to shout out a few folks who made this work possible. Both the tutoring network mentioned at the top of the webinar and the research study I just walked through were made possible by generous support from Accelerate, who has elevated the importance of research to drive instructional improvement and has been willing to say yes to all of our ideas. Also, TNTP, who is a frequent partner of ours, provided all of the technical assistance around building the instructionally coherent interventions and helped Dr. Phillips, who you'll hear from in just a moment, bring her vision to life in Knox County. Now I'm excited to introduce the Tennessee and national education leaders who are joining us for our panel discussion to share more about the incredible work that led to these strong outcomes. Principal Taisha Young is the current principal of Carter Elementary School in Knox County. Prior to this, she served as the principal of Pond Gap Elementary, which participated as a pilot school for instructional coherence. During this time, she led Pond Gap to adopt instructionally coherent approach to literacy instruction, resulting in the strongest learning gains in the district for Pond Gap's youngest readers. As a leader, Principal Young focuses on shared accountability and leverages data to enable learning gains for her students. Dr. Erin Phillips has worked in Knox County Schools since 2022 and currently serves as the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning. Knox County Schools is the third largest public school system in Tennessee, serving a diverse population of approximately 60,000 students. Under Dr. Phillips' leadership, teachers and leaders are intentionally focusing on literacy as a deserved right for every student. And last, Jen Bronson serves as Managing Director of Programs at Accelerate. Accelerate is a national nonprofit focused on scaling high-impact and evidence-based strategies to improve learning in public schools across the country. In this role, she works with Accelerate's grantees to understand emerging best practices, explore implementation challenges, and encourage the adoption of promising strategies for student learning. I'd like to begin with a question for all of you. We just discussed the incredibly strong results of instructional coherence from the randomized control trial. What stands out most to you about these results, and what do they mean for Tennessee students who benefit from intervention? I may start with you, Erin.
Thanks, Courtney. These results are exciting. I think that one of the things that we need to consider when reviewing the study and the results from the study is that we have data, historical data, that indicated in Knox County at least that what we've been doing for students wasn't making an impact. And so this data is exciting because we have an opportunity to serve all kids. I think one of the unique things that we did in the study is we really chose schools wisely to participate, representing affluent areas, urban areas, rural areas, and suburban areas so that we could um, glean information as to the widespread impact this could have for student learning.
Thank you, Erin. Jen, I may turn to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And first of all, I'm just so privileged to be here today and to have been any part of this RCT and having worked so closely with Dr. Phillips through this evaluation. So what stood out to me, Courtney, you mentioned earlier a win-win-win. I'm gonna see your three wins and raise you a fourth win because it's so rare to find something that, as you mentioned, is good for kids, good for educators, and budgets. But I'm also going to add that in school, high dosage tutoring is an intervention that is beloved by parents as well. And so I'm going to call that a win-win-win-win.
Love.
And to be more specific, 50 Can just released results from a public poll last week of over 20,000 parents from all 50 states, including Tennessee. And the most popular policy and education, you guessed it, is free high dosage tutoring for K-12 students that are behind grade level in school. So 86% of parents agreed that somewhat or strongly agreed that public funding should provide access to free tutoring in school. It had bipartisan support. It was across all 50 states, and Tennessee was included in that, polling at 85%. So again, parents want tutoring, educators want coherent intervention in tutoring. The coherent approach is also cost effective, as you've mentioned, and most importantly, it works for kids, and that is what stood out to me.
Thank you. Principal Young, would love to hear your perspective as a school leader.
Awesome. So I think that what stood out to me the most was just alignment, and we didn't add more time in our day or a brand new program. I think the key change was that intervention matched what students were already learning in tier one, and we're continuously seeing that coherence matters. And just the results of, the 1.3 additional months of learning overall results, as far as, and also the Pond Gap 4.1 stronger gains. I think it just tells me that it's not just a new thing that we're trying, like it really impacts student growth. And when students are the furthest behind, benefit the most, that's what works. That's what we want to happen in our schools. And I think just for all Tennessee students, especially those who benefit from intervention, it just means that support does not have to feel disconnected or separate, and students can stay anchored in that grade level learning while receiving extra help they need. But instead of juggling multiple programs with different routines and expectations, they build deeper understanding with the same materials. And I just think that it goes back to belonging, and all kids belong in tier one, and they're not on a different track. You just need more time and support with the same strong instruction. And we were able to bring that to our students, which just warms my heart. But it also took a lot of training and mindset shifts and change, just not doing the same old thing, but also not doing anything brand new, just doing it coherently and together in that space.
Yeah, I love that point about belonging, which we haven't really touched on and we didn't formally measure, but you're right. Kids want to feel successful in their classroom. And what this coherent approach does is set them up to be successful when they get into that tier one classroom so that they can participate and engage in the same way that their peers are. So I love that point. I think that's really important. Dr. Phillips, I'm going to come to you again next. At the district level, you contributed a great deal to this pilot, especially in helping reconfigure the framework for how you responded to student data throughout the process. Specifically, you leveraged curriculum embedded assessments and skills tracking to really triage students in a strategic way. Can you help other district and school leaders understand how they could replicate that? What was the lift like for you, both the time and the capacity lift, as well as the change management lift, which we know is not small, particularly in large districts? And why did you feel compelled to take on this big new challenge, other than you're just insane in the best way?
So let me start with your last question and work my way backwards.
Yeah.
Why did I jump into this and walk alongside Score and Accelerate in this work? Number one goes back to our vision. Every student deserves to be
Yeah.
literate. And we had data that was proving that we weren't achieving that vision. And we'd been doing the same thing year over year over year and expecting different results. And it was time to not do the same thing and try something else. With the root cause of that being that all students deserved to be literate, and every student deserves to be a tier one student all day long, every day, because that's what they are in every setting that they're supported within. They are a tier one student who deserves to gain mastery and full command of tier one content. So that was my why, was we've got to do something different, and try something else. So when you think about the lift for this, what I will say is historically, when we push out new initiatives that deal with curricula, we often start at the teacher level. And we sometimes, I won't say always, but sometimes we overlook the leader level.
Mhm.
This change management structure had to start at the leader level. I had to work with principals to help them understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, the impact that their leadership has within their building. Teachers don't know who I am. They know who Principal Young is. They are following her. They're not following me. So I needed to empower our leaders to understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, the leadership actions that could drive this change. What are those enabling conditions, if you will, that allow a school leader to carry forward instructional coherence while also understanding that teachers need support in that effort and that students will benefit from the hard work that's going to take place. I'm not going to sit here and tell other school districts or leaders across the state that this work was easy right out of the gate. It wasn't. It took a lot of hard work. It took a lot of planning. I will say that from the district level, this is replicable. We had the opportunity to consider what curriculum embedded diagnostic level assessments we had at our disposal. The QPA and the QSA came with our high quality instructional materials. And what we talked about in this effort was we needed to understand the first point of error a student was experiencing, stacked against the systematic scope and sequence of our high quality instructional material. What the beautiful thing about this diagnostic assessment is that it strategically aligns to our systematic scope and sequence. So when we evaluate students using this assessment, we can pinpoint their first point of error and determine, one, have we taught that yet? Has it already been taught in the learning progression? So often we are saying it's a deficit when we have not taught it to proficiency yet. Two, if it has been taught, how far back? Like, where is this in the learning progression, and what implications might this first point of error have for students? And then, what's the alignment to tier one? Where's that cyclical review going to take place? And how do we approach providing students with coherence from an and mindset and not an or mindset? And what I mean by that is, let's not just focus on the deficit area. Let's understand the first point of error, provide service in that deficit, but also look for grade level application in decodable texts so that we're not asking students to have a cognitive load that is spent learning how to be a student over here in tier two or tier three, and then having to translate what it means to be a student over here in tier one. It's the same learning expectation in both environments, with the same academic terminology, with the same systematic scope and sequence, with the same instructional routines. So let's free that cognitive load. We have been asking some of our most at-risk students to carry a heavier cognitive load than we've been asking of students who are on grade level or even above grade level, by essentially code switching from place to place. So let's remove a barrier within our control and support coherence. I kind of danced around your question just a little bit because I got excited. But I will say that as far as a lift from me, I would say the heaviest lift is remaining consistent, building up your coalition of like-minded leaders at the school level to continue your battle cry and walk in support with you so that teachers understand what we're doing and we have widespread understanding, and having the fundamental understanding that I'm not going to get everyone to buy in right away. First, I need them to try it out. And once you try it out and you can see the benefit with your own students, then your belief structure might shift.
I love that. There are a couple of really important points you made there that I want to reemphasize. One, when we're operating with a different scope and sequence or without the full set of information, sometimes what was intended to be intervention was actually acceleration because kids were working on skills that they hadn't gotten to in their tier one scope and sequence. And so I think that's really important. And then also, we sometimes underestimate the cognitive lift of switching routines and practice strategies. So if in tier one, we're calling it magic E, and then when I go to intervention, it's called silent E or tricky E, if we're doing sight words or tricky words, that's a lot for kids to keep straight in their head. So limiting the amount of code switching they're having to do is really important. And then I love that concept of not a buy-in, but a try-in. And I think that's a beautiful transition to Principal Young because I remember you, when we spoke to you, saying like, everybody should try this. Like, just don't be scared, give it a try. So zooming in from the district to the school level, Principal Young, you had a wealth of knowledge on both managing student learning data and school leadership that you shared with us in the case study that we have in our report on Pond Gap. And throughout the pilot, you really dedicated your school to strong implementation. And that started from you and your leadership team. Can you help us understand your mindset and what motivated you to go all in and be willing to try instructional coherence? And what was that like at the school level, the change management process to get your teachers to come along with that? We're just eager to figure out how we could create more coherence champions like you.
Yes, and I think that first and foremost, when we look at data, data is attached to feelings. So sometimes when we try to be in alignment, preach, coherence, we have to be rooted in data. No matter how hard it is, we have to evaluate where we are. And if we're going to be serious about growing, we got to be willing to look at the facts and ask whether what we're doing is actually working. So just looking back at one point, more than 50% of our students were in intervention, and that number forced us to pause, but really not until, we started the study to kind of be able to progress monitor that in a way that we can truly see. And we were all working really hard. The teachers were giving everything they had, but the data told us that our system was not producing the results that we wanted. So I think that leadership requires you to step back and let the facts guide the conversation, not emotion, not being comfortable, but just straight up facts. And when we finally looked closely, we realized that our students were experiencing multiple programs, routines, and expectations, and it wasn't helping them build confidence or mastery. And just this instructional coherence gave us a way to test whether, alignment would make a difference, and the results confirmed it. So just my mindset going in is that if we want to have different results, we have to examine our systems, and you have to examine your systems frequently and adjust and get to what you desire to get to. So I think that just the percentage of students needing intervention dropped to 32%, but you don't know that going in. So like you said, you just have to trust the process. You have to be willing to try. You have to be the lead learner in those spaces where there's a lot of angst or, this is too much. We don't want to do this, but just being able to, hold people accountable and train people. Like if you don't understand or know or don't feel confident, let's train. Let's spend that time and put in the effort to train teachers and paraprofessionals, and treat intervention with the same importance that we treat tier one instruction, and not something that's separate. So it meant being present in the work. It meant internalizing intervention materials to make sure that they're being implemented correctly, and not just leaving the fidelity checks or the walks to my coach. I went on some and I learned a lot, and I was able to bring that back into different spaces. They showed up everywhere. I mean, I bring, those things that I learned within that time frame into my everyday. So it's just become a practice, and it's just ignited and motivated me to continue the work. And just being able, it's almost like you can just spot it, when it's not coherent, and you're just like, nope, we're going to try this again, and we're going to, set the expectations so that we can be aligned. And our district, and Dr. Phillips leads this so well. And it's just been something that has been changing the mindset of all of our principals, because they are able to get this work. They have time to to learn about it, and then we get to take it back to our schools, and it's just becoming a whole a whole unit of implementation district wide. So I know it's not easy for her to roll it out, but I just appreciate her saying the things that need to be said in all the spaces. And it just really brings clarity to the work that we're doing, that it's not easy, but we have to do something if we want to produce the growth that we want and for students to be successful.
Thank you for that. I love that concept of being the lead learner in the building. And I think that's really important, especially when we're talking about improving systems, because the materials that folks were using in intervention before were not bad materials. They have a lot of research base, they're strong materials. They just weren't the best that you could be using to support students to make the most gains. And so you being willing to roll up your sleeves and get in on the intervention materials and really understand how that interacts with the tier one system, I think is just really impressive. And then another point that you made that gives me a beautiful segue to you, Jen, is the importance of not being precious about your learnings and letting the data drive you where you need to go. And so I think without having research, it's hard to do that because we do operate on anecdote instead of on data. And so I think that's a really important point you made as well. And so, Jen, when we consider the phenomenal learning gains achieved by Knox County, we now confidently know that instructional coherence makes a difference. It's evidence-based, it's preferred by educators, it maximizes resources. And while our initial work with Accelerate was really focused on high dosage tutoring, and this work, while leveraging that foundational research, I think takes it to the next level in showing how a district can embed those principles of high dosage tutoring into an existing and perhaps ineffective school structure like RTI. So thinking about this from a national perspective, how could you see the findings from this study making tutoring, which has such strong evidence of impact and such strong buy-in from families, an enduring and scalable solution for schools?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And I'll probably echo a lot of what was said by Dr. Phillips and Principal Young in my response. And this research shows us why it should be an enduring practice, why coherent intervention should, but it also has revealed how we can do that. And so I'll answer this in three parts. The first is, and this is really going back to what Principal Young said around utilizing structures and resources that are already in place and not asking states, districts, and schools to add anything more or to ask for anything new. And the first, importantly, is time. Using the schedule that you already have. Schools run on schedules. I don't know a teacher that doesn't have his or her day planned to the minute. And states are usually the ones setting the guardrails for how those minutes can be used across different interventions. And the research is now clear that embedding tutoring within those existing schedules is good for kids, and using those intervention minutes for this coherent tutoring or intervention makes good sense. So we can use multi-tiered systems of support, RTI, systems that are already in place to ensure that this coherent intervention is delivered, importantly, at dosage levels that can actually move the needle for kids. And so it should be one of the capital R responses within RTI. And in some cases, as you've mentioned, you're going to get more bang for your buck using those minutes on a coherent intervention than some of the other things that we've used historically. Not that those are bad, but the evidence is pointing us in a direction that this is maybe better. And it's better for the kids that need it the most versus the alternatives that we've offered historically. So again, we're not asking states to find more time for their districts. We're just asking them to allow that time to be carved out for what we now see are effective interventions. And one state that has done this really intentionally is Arkansas. They recently released a high impact tutoring instructional coherence framework that I'd be happy to share as a resource. And among the different strategies that they lay out are using your HQIM and leveraging that alongside existing policies, using data to inform instruction, and so on and so forth. And so to end my first point of my 3 points, I'll just say that we're leaving learning gains on the table if we don't consider coherent intervention and tutoring as part of RTI. And then that takes me to my next point, which is materials. use the curriculum that you've already invested in. HQIM costs districts, states thousands, millions of dollars to vet and adopt and train teachers on. And that's just the obvious cost. If we start to think about all of the hidden costs of supplemental interventions, like the time it takes to train, the professional development, the work to align and crosswalk all those interventions to your tier one, if that's happening at all, those all come with hidden costs. So why not just use the HQIM that you've already vetted and leverage that investment just to use this for the intervention as well. And then lastly, I want to revisit one of the most striking findings from this research, which is that paraprofessionals were just as effective as teachers in driving learning gains. This isn't the first evaluation that has found this to be true, but even in some instances, it was small, but the paraprofessionals were outperforming a traditionally certified teacher. So this is just a very interesting finding that means that we can use a diverse set of individuals to deliver coherent intervention with various levels of qualification. And it really, really opens the door to the talent pool that's available to you to deliver effective intervention. Again, there's probably some cost savings associated with that. And then it allows your certified teachers to be doing the work that they're trained professionally to be able to do. So, three things that you can really leverage that makes this more or less cost neutral, which is your time, your materials, and your staff. And the combination of those three things, in my mind, make this an intervention, coherent intervention, really potentially a very enduring piece of the K-12 experience for kids across the country.
Agree wholeheartedly. Thank you for that, Jen. And I think that that's really important. And just thinking about often from state guidance, we get sort of these layers of interventions that may all be good, but they're kind of targeting the same kids. When you think about if a kid needs intervention in math and ELA or tutoring in math and ELA or SPED and MLL, and there's just not enough minutes in the day. So we've got to be more strategic about how we're serving kids who have additional needs with the limited amount of time that we have in the best way we can that's going to lead to the greatest impact. I'm going to close out with one final question for all of you all and would remind our guests to drop any questions you may have in the Q&A box. But I'll start with you, Principal Young, and then I'll come to you, Jen, and we'll close out with Dr. Phillips. But as we think about the results that were discussed today, what's next? How do we really seize this moment and continue to advance learning and literacy through instructional coherence? What needs to change to make this approach the norm and not the exception? So, Principal Young, I'll start with you.
I truly believe, like, as we think about the results, I think it continues with the mindset. We have to stop viewing intervention as a separate system and just start viewing it as an extension of tier one. And then it has to be in expectations, and it starts at the district level. I mean, we were a pilot this time, but now it's become an expectation as a part, of my philosophy, but also in the people in the schools that I lead, and just being able to clearly communicate that intervention should reinforce the tier one, and that when that's clear, I think that schools can plan accordingly. And I think that leadership matters. Principals and districts have to stay involved in intervention the same way that we're involved in tier one. And that means attending data meetings. That means sitting in PLCs. That means understanding the materials yourself, and then holding the work, with accountability. And that also means training and including everyone. Teachers, paraprofessionals, interventionists, leaders, that we all have to be grounded in the same high quality instructional materials. And when everybody speaks the same language, coherence becomes the norm. And I feel like we have to trust the process as well and give it time, because it's not something that's going to happen overnight, because growth doesn't happen overnight, but slowing down the constant changing and giving students more time with aligned materials is key. And I think that as we understand and use data and we measure the growth through, progress monitoring, I think we can see that we'll see students entering and exiting, intervention. And that just builds momentum. And I think it's something that we can really get excited about, but it's not something that just happens overnight. It's not something that you can arrive to because you get a different cohort of students every year. And you have to figure out a way to create access and make sure that tier one, like we got to get it right. I said it in my leadership team meeting this year. Our goal for next year is to get tier one right,
Yeah.
to be sure that we're making those decisions based on us being able to implement it correctly first, and being able to reflect on what we're giving kids and how we're their student experience. So I think it just starts with everybody being on the same page, and it just being district all the way down to everyone, and just continuing to bring it up no matter what. Like every moment, I can throw out the instructional cycle of improvement, or I can put up our arrows to be sure that we're not creating new things. We are really focusing on aligning materials, and then follow up too is important, because you have to go see what's happening in the classrooms and provide content specific feedback, not just good job, but content specific feedback to everybody, including the people who are leading those interventions as well.
Yeah, so lots of pearls of wisdom there. I heard consistency, follow through, making sure that's critical. Also, something that you emphasized earlier in your answer that I think really resonates with me is just how we include paraprofessionals and support staff in those instructional decisions. I know Principal Young, that's something that you all invited them to the data meetings when you were talking about what students needed. I think that's a really powerful practice and how we can get them engaged in that educational decision making. I know another district that I work with, Bristol, who's done a ton of work in instructional coherence. They started paying their parapros to come to any training they were doing on HQAM because they realized anything our teachers are hearing, they need to hear as well. And so I think there are a lot of ripple effects from this like concept of instructional coherence to broader system coherence, and how are we making sure that we're all operating from the same set of information. Jen, I'm going to come to you next. What's next? How do we seize the momentum from this and scale this to more places?
Yeah, I would say certainly for state leaders, they need to consider how the guidance and the policy frameworks that they're rolling down encourage instructionally coherent intervention and just instructional coherence across the board, tutoring and within their RTI frameworks. As I said earlier, look at what Arkansas has done. And what that means is setting expectations for your district and school leaders that coherent intervention, that it fits within these prescribed minutes within the schedule that already exists, guidance for how to use that HQIM that they've invested in, and then clarifying that a diverse set of adults can deliver a number of different interventions effectively. For district leaders, then I would say I would encourage you not to wait for the state to invite you to coherence. You have autonomy and potentially, for instance, a win block or something, and you can kind of seize the momentum yourself within the system, and use the existing materials and staff that you have. And then just for advocates, I would just say that this is about systems, right? So while more funding would be lovely, we wouldn't turn that down, but advocating for the use of these sort of existing resources like minutes, personnel, materials, to sustain this instructional or this instructionally coherent intervention for the long term, is what I would recommend and where I hope we go.
Yeah, I love that. I love that push too of like, you don't have to wait till it's a mandate. You can do it. Aaron and Principal Young are great examples of that. So I love that push. Aaron, what's next for you? How are you thinking about this?
Well, we've already taken some next steps here in Knox County. We didn't slow down. So the study made me think if our youngest students had an instructionally coherent learning experience from kindergarten on, what impact might that have?
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we have started just testing, if you will, is what if kindergarten students had instructionally coherent learning experiences in tier one, Tier 2, Tier 3, ESL, and special education. And
Mhm.
that systematic scope and sequence was aligned. And kids truly had additional attempts, additional time to process, learn, apply, practice what is being taught in Tier 1 to gain mastery and full command. Would that impact the number of students who are being referred for special education? Would that impact the number of students who traditionally qualified for Tier 2 and Tier 3 services with using universal screening percentiles? What impact might that have? And if we were to experience instructionally coherent learning in kindergarten and roll that up throughout a child's educational career, what impact might that have? And so that's kind of the work that we're doing right now as a district is we are eliminating some of the noise, to be honest. So the other part of that is let's clear the pathway for leaders to make strong decisions and for teachers to make strong decisions by educating, but also having part in some of the removal of things that aren't feeding success for students. I think the other part is having really honest discussions with state leaders, with principals and teachers about how to maximize our efforts toward instructional coherence and the impact that that has on a master schedule at the school level. And Ty can speak to this. In order to do instructional coherence well, teachers have to have opportunities to collaborate and talk about students and think about the impact that teaching and learning is having on the trajectory of a learning, or I said trajectory, but I mean on the learning progression for students,
Mhm.
and what we can control and not control. How do we take hold of the barriers that we have power over and make really strong instructional decisions for students?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. There's so much in there. I'm so excited to follow what you all are doing with kindergarten. And I think one thing that maybe we haven't touched on as explicitly during this conversation, we've talked a lot about foundational skills, but coherence is about more than foundational skills. We know that there are kids who have strong mastery of the code, and really their gap is knowledge. And so this instructionally coherent intervention can also be used to pre-read text that they're going to engage in Tier 1, to reread text that they've already engaged in, to do deep word work with vocabulary that may be tricky, to read aligned text to get them to that volume of reading on specific topics so they really have deep understanding. So there are lots of different applications to this, and coherence is more than just foundational skills. But thank you so much for that, Erin. And then a couple of questions in the chat. One that I'll answer quickly of if there is a place to view the recording. Yes, we will send this out after the webinar and make sure to have it on our website. So can answer that one. And then this is a great question that Erin, I would love for you to answer because the curriculum that Knox County uses, Benchmark Advanced, does have an intervention supplement. This participant is asking, what if current Tier 1 curriculum doesn't include aligned intervention materials or diagnostics? What would you do then? And I know, Erin, you and I have talked about this, so I would love to hear what your advisement would be to someone whose materials don't come with that.
Yeah. I think that, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit already, and Jen has mentioned it a couple of times, as well as you, Courtney, is this idea that we can take elements of the Tier 1 high quality instructional materials and utilize them in intervention. We have most high quality instructional materials come with complex texts, opportunities for authentic, purposeful practice. How do we take those opportunities and use them again in a small group area? So using that Tier 1 curriculum, I think, is important. Also thinking about what that systematic scope and sequence looks like in foundational literacy. I would also say foundational numeracy, thinking about the knowledge building strand. All of that is something that we need to consider when we're thinking about materials usage in intervention. Much to your point just now, Courtney, it's not just about foundational literacy. We have opportunities to look at intervention as an opportunity to preview and review what's taking place in Tier 1 so that students have additional access to gain mastery of that learning opportunity.
And let me tell you, if you've ever seen a classroom where kids have had that opportunity, you will walk in and not be able to tell the kids who are a little bit below grade level because they feel so confident and excited to jump into the discussion with the rest of their peers because they've built that confidence in a smaller group on the content. So thank you for that. This next one I might direct to Principal Young. Just a note that this is a pretty big change from traditional intervention. So I would love to hear how your folks, particularly those who are delivering intervention, received this kind of shift in focus, how you managed their buy-in around that.
I think it starts with data, of course, and putting it in a way that people understand, not just spreadsheets. Everybody's not a spreadsheet person. We use some visuals, and we try to change mindset too. I think that just having an urgency coming, from myself as a leader, and just being able to combat it. Well, let's work through it. Let's schedule a time to sit down and look at what the hard part is, and then just clearly stating that this is what we're doing. Coherence is the expectation, and our HQIM has everything that we need. So it required shifting from searching for new things or Google, just finding things everywhere, or flashcards and things like that. It just switched from searching for new programs to fully implementing what we already had the right way. And I think that the walkthroughs focused on, tier one, also in as well as intervention, and just being able to give the feedback. We modeled some lessons throughout our time to just be sure that oral rehearsal was a natural part of our practice as well before delivering instruction. So a lot of things surfaced during the time that we were practicing, but it gave us time to see the transfer from when we practiced to now. So I think we kind of leaned on, really, let's fully implement what we already have before we start looking for something else. And then once people understood it and felt comfortable with it, they could see that their kids were more aware of what they were talking about from intervention to tier one. Coming back to intervention, they've already looked at the story, or it's their third read, like they were having those types of conversations, very familiar with the sound cards, like all of the materials look the same. So I think that it really just helped us to implement it better, but also going to see what's happening. And if there is something that you see a trend in, we were able to address that trend as a team. And it was, on our admin agenda. It was, in our staff. We're a part of this. This is what we're doing. And you really just have to be a cheerleader, like if nobody is the cheerleader for it, the principal has to be a cheerleader for it. And we have to be able to congratulate and recognize people who are doing it well.
And if you would have gone back to them at the end of the year and said, okay, never mind, we're going back to the way we did things before, what do you think they would have said?
That's actually true, because I'm not at Pond Gap anymore, and they're still doing it.
Yeah. Okay.
So
That's what I thought. That's
that
what I was
helps
hoping
to
you would
know
say.
that it is something that we're doing. So I think that it is it changed, their minds over time, but just I made sure I shared, the information and sent the information, and just being able to talk through it with the instructional coaches, but also the teachers who and the interventionists who were leading those groups. We still talk. So I'm just like, what are y'all doing? So I'm progress monitoring, even though I'm not there.
But I think that's important because sometimes interventions or initiatives work because of the leader. And I think this is a great example of you built such a strong belief in the team at Pond Gap that it's continued after you've left even. And I think that's a really powerful testament to your leadership. Well, I could talk about this for the rest of the day, but unfortunately, we are closing out our time together. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us to share their wisdom. I know that this has been super inspiring for me to dig in with you all and to just share more about what you've learned. I know a couple of folks asked in the Q&A box where they could find the resources. So you should see them being dropped both in the chat, and then here are some QR codes that have a number of resources, including the white paper that presents the research findings and has a 3-page deep dive on Pond Gap and the specific school level moves they made to ensure their strong implementation. And then later today, we'll follow up via email with a recording of this webinar, as well as all of the resources that were discussed today. But again, thank you all for your deep engagement, and we will continue elevating this issue and hope you will join us in that. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.